How's it going? This is James from James Films, and it's been a little while. I'm sorry for the big delay in tutorials. It's been a pretty busy past couple months for both the freelance work I do, designing a lot of different album artwork, concert visuals, commercials in 3D, a lot of the stuff that you see over on my Instagram at James_films, but also very much for my main job, my 9 to 5, which is working at NASA as a TV host and producer. I create a lot of different documentary series about our different missions and also jump on the microphone to host some big events like our sample return from the OSIRIS-REx mission that just took place last September, spacecraft launches, and big celestial events like the eclipse. We had both an annular eclipse as well as the total eclipse across America that just took place back in April of this year. So been very blocked up, but finally getting a chance to turn my attention over to tutorials once again, and starting off with a really fun beginner tutorial here that leverages some assets from one of my friends, Florian, who is running an amazing company called B Production. It is over here on the Blender market. I've linked this in the description of this video. Highly recommend you check this resource page out because it's got pretty much everything that you could need to create some fantastic scenes, from crowd simulations with the population add-on to gobos, which are animated light textures like different leaves and branches that give your scene an extra added edge, some realism to it. Two of the most common ones I use in a lot of my scenes, grass blade and vegetation. And if you stick around to the end of this tutorial, I'm going to be using vegetation a little bit to add in some of the plants that you see here in our scene. But today we're going to be talking mainly about Potter's Touch, which is a new one that just came out recently here. And actually, if you are watching this video early enough, they do have a 25% discount. It is with the coupon code POTTER25. Again, this is linked in the description. So I'm in a new Blender scene here. We have our default cube here, and we also have in the bottom left of your screen, the screencast key is enabled. So as I move things around or press buttons, you'll see that pop up there. So you'll be able to follow along as I work. This is just a matter of personal preference, but to start off every scene, I like to kind of get all my windows set up how I like. So I typically like to drag this bottom part up here and have this as my shader editor. So I'm just going to switch that on to shader editor for now. And usually I work with a second monitor showing my render view, but since I'm only working off the one, I'm going to go up to the top right here and drag this over. So I use this top right one as my rendered preview. And if I hit 0 on my numpad, this will snap into what my camera is seeing. And for this, let's design this as if we're putting this on, vertical format, like an Instagram Reels type thing. So I'm going to switch to my resolution of 1080 by 1920 pixels. This is giving you a nice vertical resolution. And you can also just click on render region here. So it's only rendering what's within that box here. This will just save you if you're using, kind of a lower end computer. I used to start off things on my old laptop, and if it was rendering stuff outside of that frame there, it was really killing my machine. So it's, helpful to have that checked on as well. For the camera for now, I'm just going to hit Alt-R and Alt-G, and this is just going to reset its location and rotation to the origin. We don't really need this for now. We're actually also going to delete the default cube, but this camera we're going to adjust eventually later. What I found is very helpful is to create all of your scenes with the camera's view in mind. So no extra stuff needs to be made. Just kind of focus on what's in the frame of your composition. We're also going to go over the object data properties, and I'm going to hit the clipping here to something kind of ludicrous like 999,999. So that means that anything, including our background that we'll eventually put in, will not be clipped off our camera view here. So with that set up, I'm going to go over to our render properties. We're not going to be using Eevee for this. I like cycles a lot better. It just looks really fantastic with these very high resolution things. We're also going to enable denoising the viewport just so we're not fighting through noise. And I'm going to use optics because I have an NVIDIA GPU that will allow me to do that denoising. You can also use open image denoise or automatic. I prefer optics. I also have optics usually checked on for my render. You don't need this many samples typically. Usually I'll render with around maybe 120 to 200 range for an animation. If you're doing a still image, you can crank that up a little bit higher. But you can kind of do a couple different processes of looking at this just to kind of see what will work for you. So we have our viewport enabled here, and the main add-on that we're going to be using, it's not really an add-on, if you will. Your typical add-ons will show up in this tab over here. So you can see I've got a lot of these ones that are enabled over here. This Potter's Touch is actually going to be used in your asset library. And if you've never used that, this is a fairly new feature for Blender within the past maybe year or two. This has been added in. It's fantastic. It's something that you can actually use with your own assets and add-ons. that I've actually added a bunch to. So if I go over to my asset browser, you see I have a bunch here. But I also have, a variety of different ones that I've created too. So these are different, columns and things that I've modeled over the years that I can use to just drag and drop into my scene. I can see it takes a second sometimes to load up if it's a larger piece of geometry, but this is, a little archway that I modeled. And so sometimes I'll use this in my scene. And as opposed to having to do this from scratch, you can just drag and drop it into your scene. The same principle applies to textures, and in our case, the Potter's Touch 8K asset library here. So this comes with 26 different textures. You can see them nicely laid out here. These are the 8K versions. But the way you load this up, if you haven't already, there's tutorials on this and also on the Potter's Touch Blender Market page that will show you exactly how to do this. But you save out the files that are there that you get when you purchase this. You go over to Edit, Preferences, and then locate in your file paths where that is located, and you can link that library. So I've already done this. But you would just go to file paths and choose where this is located on your hard drive. And then the next time you load Blender up, it will appear there. And it's as simple as literally just dragging and dropping this onto an object. I don't have an object loaded up here for now, but you can just do that simply in your scene. I'm going to remove this light for now here too. So to start things off, we're going to add in a mesh, and we're going to use a plane for this. I'm going to scale this up a little bit more, and we're going to push it back a little bit here. It doesn't really matter, how scaled up this is or not. Maybe I'll scale a little bit more in the x-axis. And this is going to be our kind of main building here. And so when I'm starting off a project, I always like to gather references and inspiration for what I'm designing. So I have this really great piece of software called PureRef. It allows you to just quickly drag and drop images as you're searching on Instagram or on Google or wherever, Pinterest. And you can just drag and drop them into a nice little area here. You can very easily scroll in and zoom in on different things. So if I'm trying to do some detailing and I kind of forget, what the edge of one of these frames would look like of this window, I can zoom in and see, okay, there's a little bit of this kind of smooth edge here, but then it kind of, gets a little bit kind of more stuccoed as it goes further out here. You can see some kind of these cracks and different things from, weathering or erosion, over years of use on this. You got some rust on these. So it's always helpful to have these as inspiration. And in this case, we're going to be kind of designing a scene that looks a lot like Santorini in Greece with these kind of vibrant blues. This has that kind of Potter's Touch look to it. If I look back at these clay textures, you can see some of these kind of match up pretty well with both that and also this kind of main structure here too. And we'll also do a little bit of modeling, a little bit of sculpting to kind of get some more imperfections here to really bring out those extra details. Because you can see in the real world, nothing is ever perfectly straight or smooth. It's very, very rare that you find something that is like perfectly, an edge here, perfectly smooth edge. So if I look at this, this is one of the sharpest parts of this image. You can still see some kind of warble and distortion, little cracks and divots and things along this edge here too, from different edge wear. And even at these kind of smooth slope parts too, you see there's kind of holes and divots and things all throughout it too. And this is definitely not a smooth, straight edge. This is kind of warped, as, rain has hit it over the years or wind has kind of, caused some erosion from it. But, it's still in general, it's pretty smooth. But you can see that it's got that really nice clay texture to it that is kind of along there. So we're going to model out some windows like this, these archway type windows. We'll make a doorway to walk into. And we'll also model this kind of blue bright dome here as well. So I'll just kind of keep this up as inspiration in the background as I begin this. I'll go back over to my Blender scene here, and I'm going to tab into edit mode, and we're actually just going to hit E on our keyboard to extrude, and then just pull this straight up. And so this is now our building scene. And so that is looking like our default cube again. However, what I can do here is go over to my modifiers tab, add a modifier. We're going to hit generate, and we're going to want to do this solidify modifier. I'm just going to increase this a little bit here. You're not going to see really any change from this perspective. But what I'm now going to be able to do is add in a cube, and we're going to pull this out here. So it's kind of out intersecting our frame. I'm not actually going to pull this up by hitting G and Z, constraining that motion to the Z axis. And then we're going to have with this selected, I'm just going to select in edge mode by hitting 2 on my keyboard, just this edge and this edge, hit Control B to bevel. We're going to pull these together. You don't want them to intersect because you can see there's that weird intersecting geometry that you'll get if you kind of overlap them. But you want to get as close as possible. So I'm right here. And before you hit left click to commit this bevel, you will scroll up on your mouse. And this allows you to have some more edge cuts here to get a little bit more detail to this archway. Now that I'm satisfied with that, I can hit the left click on my keyboard, and that commits that bevel mesh to our little archway. So it's kind of hard to see what's going on here. So what I'm going to do is actually go over to my object properties, scroll down to viewport display, and it's currently displaying this as textured, which we don't really want. We want this to be as wired so we can actually see this a little bit better. And now what I'm going to do is actually cut out this little doorway from our scene here. And so if I tab this down for a second, I can go to generate and then Boolean. I'm going to switch to fast and use this little eyedropper tool to select our cube. And you can see it's cut this away. It's also cut away a part of this floor, which I don't really want. So I'm going to go tab into edit mode here, go to face select, grab this bottom face and pull this up a little bit. So now you kind of have this little lip to the doorway here, which I think looks quite nice. And you can see what that solidify modifier did as well too. Now it's hollow within here, but just these edges of our cube, our plane originally, are now giving that really nice solidified effect. And you can see, let me actually zoom our camera out a bit more so you can actually see a little bit more of what's going on here. Maybe we change the focal length a little bit so it's maybe a little bit wider angle so you can actually kind of see this rooftop. We'll do maybe 24 millimeters. Move it just a little bit closer. And then also what I like to do is turn on our viewport display composition guides here, our rule of thirds and our center, just to kind of get an idea for composition and framing. Tab into N into our item tab and just turn the rotation up just a little bit so we're looking up at our scene here, because I'm going to be adding in that little dome above our scene eventually here too. You can always change these later, but again, I find it helpful working out of this view. And also you can go to this passepartout and turn this up so that the opacity on the edges is a little bit darker, because you can see it's currently showing these edges a little bit too much. It's a little bit hard to see that. So I usually like to turn this up to somewhere in like the 0.9 range. So it's a little bit darker around there. You can see a little bit more of what the camera view is going to be seeing ultimately. Okay, great. So we've got our doorway here. And again, you can always change this because I've not committed this change just yet. What I'd like to do is kind of keep this open for the time being until I'm very satisfied with all my cuts. And then you can go over to your modifiers for this cube, or for a plane rather, and then you can hit apply. But what I always recommend doing is duplicating this once you're adding all the booleans in, and just have this as a backup just in case you want to go back and change your geometry, because once you apply these things, you can't go back and fix it. Right now it's non-destructive. All of these are just being added in here. But once you commit those changes, it is in fact a destructive operation, and you will have to go back and start over once again. I'm going to add in another cube here, and this one is going to be for my windows in both the front and the back here. So I'm going to pull this in front of my frame here, pull this up a little bit. And this is kind of those, those little windows. So I'm going to kind of shrink this down a little bit here. Let's maybe, pull this up just a little bit more. And then pull this guy up a little bit more here too. We can maybe scale it up a little bit more there. We're going to do the same thing as before, grabbing these edges. Let me just kind of look from the front mode. Actually, we want this to kind of like line up a bit more with this, this window here. So we're going to kind of lift this up there. That looks good to me. Grab these edges and we're going to pull this in as well. And you see it has those same bevel profile as before, so I can just click that, commit it. You can always shrink this down a little bit too. I might just shrink that just a little bit more and might just pull this part down a bit too. And so now we've got our window. So I can go over to our array modifier and I'm going to just add this along here. So we've got these kind of on either side of our doorway. Looks good to me. It's just kind of a little bit off center. That's fine there. And we can actually just have this once again show in our viewport as wire. As wire. So we don't want this to be kind of cutting everything off here. And if we go back to our plane, we can add in another Boolean modifier. Once again, hitting fast, and this time selecting our window cubes. And you could see that is intersecting for our window, which is looking great. So you can kind of move this over here as well. And I do kind of want some kind of back window there as well. So I'm actually just going to duplicate this one here. I'm going to turn off that array modifier just for a second while I can kind of see this, pull this all the way to the back. And I kind of want this maybe to be a little bit smaller, this window, and there to be 3 or 4 of them kind of in the back there. So I'm just going to scale this down just a little bit, maybe kind of shrink the width a little bit here and turn that array modifier back on. I don't want it to be spaced out as much as that. So we can kind of space these out here. Maybe there's like 5 of them there in the back. Go back to our camera view and let's line this up as much as possible with that vertical there. So that looks pretty good to me. Maybe we do space these out just a hair more, so it kind of fills out a little bit more of the scene out there. Maybe just a touch more again, so that it is visible on either side there that there are in fact windows in that area. And let's go to our plane here once again. And we're going to cut these out using our Boolean modifier, one more Boolean modifier. So this is a very super simple workflow doing this. Oops, I selected the plane again. There we go. So now we've got our windows and our doorway here in our scene. So This is, again, not committed. So if I move this plane here, you can see it's not added on it yet. So we're actually gonna have to apply these in order to have it as our geometry, and then we can actually get to sculpting. But once again, I like to kind of go through and do a gut check just to make sure everything looks good. That solidify modifier is looking okay. And one thing I was noticing when I was looking at the pure ref here is there's this kind of interesting bevel of this almost like little lip here above our main structure. So I'm going to add that in here. So we're going to tab into edit mode, and you'll notice that the Booleans are not showing here in edit mode. If you want it to show that, you can go over to your modifiers and have it display in edit mode. So if it's not too high intense geometry, that will load up fine. What I'm going to do now in face select mode, I'm going to hit Control R, and that will allow me to do these loop cuts. I can hit the left mouse button and then drag this up so it's close to that top lip there. And so what I'm going to do is actually, before I do that, I'm just going to inset the roof a little bit here so this doesn't mess up this geometry here, because we're going to want to do a little bit of a lip there as well. I'm just going to kind of pull this in a bit here for now, just so we have that there. I just want this to affect just that edge. And so what I'm going to do is go to face select, hit Alt, Shift, and then click on one of these edges, and this selects the whole loop of this all around. And you can hit Alt and E, and this brings up this little menu that allows you to select extrude faces along normals. And so now we're just pulling this out along the normal of our scene. Just give it like a little bit of a extrusion. And you can see this edge is extremely sharp here, right? And again, like I said, in real world, you don't really see these sharp edges as much, especially as I'm looking here, there's this kind of natural, like kind of bevel to it here. So let's actually add that bevel in as well. I'm going to go to edge select mode by hitting 2. And we're going to use that same technique again by hitting Alt, Shift, and then clicking on one of these edges. Oops, I have the top one selected. Alt, Shift, and click. And now that's selected this whole edge loop around. And we can hit Control and B to bevel this and kind of pull up slightly. You don't want to pull up too much. Maybe I don't need that much geometry there either as well, too. That looks pretty good. And we can click to commit that change. And now you see we've got this nice little sloping bevel to it, which looks pretty great. And so for this top part here, I'm just going to pull on this and just extrude it up just a little bit here as well. This is where we're going to be adding in our dome up at the top here. And I'm just going to be adding that in with a separate layer here too. So actually with this one, we can maybe bevel this a little bit too, to just give it a little bit of a smoothing effect. You're not going to really see that necessarily, but just, you know, just for the sake of doing this, just for the sake of completion, we can make that a little bit nicer there too. So I actually want this to be as a separate object just because I'm going to be doing some extra texturing just to make it easy for myself. We'll add in a UV sphere, and we can go into edit mode, scale this up, bring it up here. We don't really need the bottom part of this, so I'm going to go to the toggle X-ray mode here, and we can go to face select and select all these and hit X, and then just delete those faces. So we just have this top part of the sphere. It's hollow here, but don't worry, we're not going to be really even seeing it once we put it on top of our building. So you can see here, if I drop this down, it's just going to be kind of going on our roof here. Can maybe scale this out a little bit more and then bring it down. If I go to top mode here, we do want this to kind of be able to fit onto our building. And that looks pretty good to me. Can hit shade smooth, and I'm also going to add in a subdivision surface just to kind of smooth out. Oops, I didn't want to solidify a subdivision surface just to smooth out that geometry. You can see what that did. So now you don't see those kind of weird edge bumps. I can just apply that as well too. No problem there. So we've got our dome, we've got our main building, but again, this is not committed, these changes. So what I'm actually going to do is hit Shift and D to duplicate this, hit M, add it to a new collection. I'm just going to label this as backup here. And we're actually going to disable this from the viewport. That's just there just in case I want all of these cuts and stuff there, just in case once I commit these changes, if there are any glitches that I can go back and change the geometry again. But I'm happy with how this looks for now. So what I'm going to do is actually go through and apply all of these to our scene. And at this point now, I can actually move all of our Booleans to that backup collection as well too, just to get them out of our view. So this now you can see is in fact real geometry, but you're seeing these kind of weird edges here. So if I was going to sculpt this, it's very low poly. So it's not really very good geometry that we're working with. So we're going to want to improve that geometry. And the way to do that is to go with our plane selected here over to the modifiers. We're going to hit generate, and then we're going to go to remesh. And you can see what that did. That added kind of this new geometry to it. And you can see it's a little bit low poly right now, and that's kind of being affected by this voxel size. So a lower voxel size, a lower voxel size is more resolution. Obviously, it's more intensive on your system as well, but it's going to give you a better result. So usually I like to turn this down as much as possible. to get a really good detail. You can see it kind of still looks like almost like a teeth mark or a bite mark or something on here. But don't worry, we're going to be kind of smoothing that out anyway with a little bit of careful sculpting to really enhance this scene. So once I turn it down to something that I'm happy with, and maybe enable smooth shading on this as well. I don't want something too heavy for my machine. I think that's fine. We can actually apply this as well. And now instead, if you remember what that geometry looked like before, if I hit tab to edit mode now, you see you've got much, much better geometry here. You've got really, really good resolution here. This gives us a lot to play with and a lot to sculpt with as well. So let's actually do a little bit of sculpting before we add in our clay texture, and then we're going to get some staircase and stuff added in here too. So if I go over to sculpt mode, I'm just going to use my clay and clay strips for the purposes of this one as well. But when I'm also working, sometimes I like to use this blob one and the crease as well. We might use that crease to sharpen up a couple edges if we smooth them too much. But let's go with this clay one. We can scale this down, and you can adjust your strength by hitting Shift and then F. This allows you to adjust your fall off as well too. And if you just hit just F, that allows you to scale up or scale down your brush here too. You can also just adjust that by up here. This radius you can adjust there too. So it's just a little hotkey here. But if I go over, I'm mainly concerned with these edges here. I kind of want to give these a little bit of like a deformation, but not too much. You can see the strength's way too high. I'm going to turn this down and just very, rough kind of just clicking around here. If you have a tablet, this is even easier to do, just to kind of give it a little bit of a deformation, if you will. Just again, these edges already kind of smoothed out a little bit. If you hit Shift, this kind of does it the opposite direction of what you're pulling. But if you were looking at those references again, you do see as you're looking at these a little bit of bumps and divots. It's still pretty sharp, but especially there was one of them in particular that we were looking at. This one here, you can see some kind of, little erosion almost to it, or this one here is a really good example. You see this kind of like warble to it as it goes around this archway. So I'm just trying to recreate that effect with these arches where, these are open to the elements. There's probably rain and stuff over these years eating away and kind of eroding these out. And this is also just to kind of smooth those voxels out a little bit too, just because it was kind of a little bit too pristine. Very subtle what I'm doing here. This really isn't a whole lot going on, but I think this is going to make kind of a bigger difference on the scene because it will look a little bit more realistic even too. These are very, very minute changes. I'm just going to really reduce that strength and radius down to maybe even like 12 and just really just get into these tight creases here just to add in a little bit more of that kind of erosional detail here to our scene. And I encourage you to take your time with this. Don't have to follow one-to-one. In fact, it's going to be very impossible for you to follow exactly one-to-one on this step here. What I would recommend is just seriously just playing around with it and just making it what you want. And you can always, again, come back to this as well as you're working with your scene. If you wanted to kind of add in a little bit more erosion as you're noticing the texture or something else lining up differently in your scene, you can always come back and kind of tweak this. I'm not going to focus as much as on the ones in the back because they're so far away from the camera that you're not really going to even see it. But if you were doing an animation and zooming in a bit more, you would maybe want to adjust that. Now I'm actually going to go over to our clay strips here. We're going to add just a little bit of kind of a bump out to here. And what I'm doing here, you're noticing, is I kind of initially clay strip this on here and then hit Shift to kind of smooth this out and kind of blend it in a little bit more into our scene. So it's not as blobby, because if you look in our camera view, you can see just how much that shows up, but just adds a little bit of an extra kind of warble to our scene as well. And that is once again mimicking kind of the distortion effect of the clay or the kind of stucco on this. If you look at some of these examples here, you can kind of see a little bit of kind of this like ballooning effect with that kind of clay or something kind of coming off here. These little strips of kind of, the concrete or whatever that was poured here, kind of bumping out a little bit into our surrounding area. And this will once again just kind of give a little bit more of a natural look to it, kind of not as sharp edges to kind of just smoothing the scene out a bit too. And this will really also enhance the look of our clay texture once we do add that in. So I don't want to distort the bottom too much there. Oops. I want to just do this a little bit. And that's probably good for now. I'll leave that as it is because we want to add in our staircase to our scene. And to do that, I'm just going to add in a simple cube. I'm going to stretch this out along the x-axis, shrink it along the z and the y. We're going to bring this forward in our scene here. And we'll look from top-down view here as we kind of line this up. We don't need this to be too thick. In fact, we don't want this to be too thick because we're then going to be adding in an array modifier. And this one, we do actually want to be stretching along the y, but or rather, the y here. So, oops, I don't want it to be along the x. It's be along the y. So you can see here, and it's going the wrong way in my case here. So this will go -0.8. And we want to pull this down that way along the z. and we are going to add a couple more to this as well. And so I can actually shrink this up just a hair more. So we have this nice little staircase, and I'm going to make this go just a little bit more in here so we have a little bit more staircase to work with. And that looks good to me for now. And if you wanted to save this as a backup, you can. I'm just going to do that as Shift D and then save that as a backup. It's not really a whole lot that we did there, but you know, if you just want to go back and edit that just in case. So now I've actually added that array modifier in there, and we can do the same thing that we just did before, kind of smoothing out these edges. But what you'll notice is the geometry is pretty low poly. So if we were to smooth this out, it won't work as well. So I'm once again going to remesh this. And this also kind of gives me a little bit of a nice smoothness to the staircase. I'm going to turn this up just a little bit more. So we do have a little bit more of these kind of ridges on the staircase. You can see how that looks. Smooth shading on that. And then we're going to apply it. So we've got this nice staircase here. And I can just do a little bit of a distortion effect again. And if you think about stairwells that are outdoors in particular over time, they get this kind of warping effect in the middle. You can kind of see it subtly there. It's a little bit, maybe not the best example. These ones are kind of different, but you can kind of still see it. As years of people walking on this, you know, inevitably the middle part starts to kind of depress a little bit under your foot as you're walking up, right? Or also the weathering. And then that just kind of further enhances it once rain and stuff. You can really see it here. There's this little bit of a kind of a bump or a downward kind of arch to it. Subtle again there, but we kind of want to mimic that a little bit too. So again, I'm going to use our clay tool here and just kind of go over our staircase. You can see that effect it's having. It just kind of smooths that part out there. Years of walking on this, right? You get the kind of smoothing effect on the stairwell. So it's not as kind of well defined. It's more of kind of this just bump to it. It's kind of natural clay steps, which looks really nice. So just kind of do that effect in there too. And the last thing I'm going to add into our scene, this looks, you know, pretty good to me. It's not perfect, but it's all right. I'm going to add in another cube. And we're going to stretch this one out on the Y. This is just going to be kind of like, you know, little side post here as you're walking up. We're not really going to even see this one necessarily too, but I just want these kind of bordering our scene a bit here. Just these kind of like guardrails almost in our scene. And I'm just going to stretch that, or array it rather, across here and move that onto this side. So there's one on each side. So that kind of just brings your perspective up into the frame a bit more here. And I'm going to apply that. Let's give it a remesh as well. And shade smooth, apply that, and then we'll just kind of distort this a little bit as well here too. Just kind of give it a little bit of a imperfection to it. All right. Not as much as maybe our staircase or building, but just a little bit more to it, just so it's a little bit deformed. All right, so that's looking pretty good. So let's actually turn off these overlays here so we can see a little bit more of our scene, because now we're going to move over to the fun part, which is the texturing, the lighting, the rendering. So for the lighting, I'm going to be using an HDRI. There's a number of these I can link in the description from HDRI Haven. They've got a great set of them. And for this one, I'm just going to be using, let's see, there's one I like a lot, this sunset one here. So I'm going to bring that in. And let's actually switch over to our shader editor. If you have the Node Wrangler add-on enabled, it's free. You can click just on the HDRI itself, hit Control-T, and that adds in a mapping, a texture coordinate node. And then you can go over to the rotation and spin this around, and you can see that lighting it has on the scene. So usually I like to kind of dial this lighting in first, get to one that I'm happy with, and then I enhance this by actually using a regular sun lamp. And then I'm going to bring this out just so I see it. This positioning doesn't matter for it. The only thing that matters is its rotation in our scene. So I kind of try to match this as much as possible to our HDRI. So this one, you see the sun's coming kind of from this back angle here, looking in at it. So I want to kind of mimic that. So I'm going to kind of have this come in that same direction. Maybe tilt it up a little bit more because this is at sunset. And we want this a little bit more tilted into our scene. And I kind of like that effect. You see in the background there, it's getting the kind of front arches projected onto the back wall, but it's this perfect white color. I want it to be kind of more matching that sunset color, that kind of deeper orange color of our scene. And then this is, again, just enhance the kind of lighting overall of our scene. There's no textures on this currently right now. So let's actually add in some of those clay textures. And again, the way to do that is just go over our asset browser. And you can look at all of these and see kind of which one you think matches the scene the best. I like this clay 15 for our main element here, this main building. And let's actually label things too. I'll just call this building, and let's call this the dome on top there. This is our staircase, and then this is our side border. Let's call it that for now. And what you can also do is just group these up by hitting M, put them in the building, like a new building collection. You can also change the color on this. So sometimes I'll make it like, more of a stone color or something like that. And so again, for adding these textures in from your asset browser, you just click on it and you can drag it onto your element. Take a second to load up there. You can see I dropped that on and now it is loaded up very quickly in the viewport. We don't want this kind of brown pot color here. We do want to kind of mimic more so this white clay texture here. And so to do that, you can just go over to the shader editor for this. And again, everything's very nifty laid out here with sliders. You can very quickly color pick or change things up a bit more. So I'm going to make this, a kind of brighter white color, maybe just a slight off-white, a little bit blue almost color to that. And I'm going to zoom in here so you can really see the details of this texture as well. You can see just how much that's come up here really well. And if I want to enhance that a bit more, I can increase the displacement power up a bit more. It kind of adds a little bit more of that stucco look to it, which is looking really nice. Maybe that's a little bit too intense, so we can kind of change the mid-level down here a bit and maybe pull the power just a bit back so it's not as much, but you can still see it's subtle enough that you do notice it in our scene. I might also change the texture scale a little bit, make it a little bit smaller here so that it stretches out more across the scene so it's not as repetitive. If I was to crank this up a lot, let's say put this at 5, you can kind of see the tiling of it a little bit too much just for this one specific example. So I'm going to kind of pull this back a bit so you can kind of see it's mapping a bit better to our larger scale object. For this roof, I'm going to add in a different, actually, you know what? Let's do the same one. I just want to show you a technique here that's helpful. So I'm going to add in that same clay 15 material. Let's actually give this a label. Let's call this clay white for the building. But what I actually want to do is make this blue. And if I do this now here, you'll see this impacts all of the textures. But I do like the same clay texture before. I just don't like the color for it here. I want to have a different color. So if you click on this, display number of users of this data, click to make a single user copy. So we can click this and actually you can see it's made this clay white 0.001, a copy of it. And if I go into this dropdown, you can see there's actually 2 of these now. So for this one, if I label this as clay blue, we can actually update the color and it'll just affect this one up top here, which is really nice. So let's match that color of the kind of roof, this dome. See, it's a very rich, deep blue. I could probably go even darker with this, maybe. Darker kind of blue with this. And the one thing I'm noticing here is the scaling of this matches up 1-to-1 with the scaling of our main building texture here. So I'm actually going to change that up a bit so that this is maybe a little bit smaller. Let's see, or maybe we go the opposite way, a little bit larger. And then we can change the displacement power so it's not as much. It's a little bit more smoothed out, that kind of dome part there. So that's looking great. Let's actually add that same white clay texture to our stairs and also to the side one here. And I don't think any adjustments are needed here. So our texturing is pretty much done at this point. So now is the fun part to start adding in some extra plants and other details. I also don't like how this background looks, and I typically don't ever use the HDRI as my background in my scene. And so instead what I'd like to do is actually go down in my render properties to film. You can enable transparent, so that actually X's out that background. And instead, I'm actually going to use an image of Santorini that I found here on Unsplash. This is a royalty-free image. You can see it's got this nice kind of mountainous background in the distance. That's going to be what we're going to see through the background of our scene here. It matches pretty closely the lighting, general lighting design. You can import it as a plane. If you don't have that enabled as well, that's also an add-on. It is free here, built in already, but you hit images, import, export, import images as planes. That allows you to import this image in. I can just scale this up immensely, and you can see it's not cropping out at all in our scene. I like being able to see those kind of mountains through there. And what I'm actually going to do is go into edit mode, just give an edge loop up here, and then stretch this sky up a bit more so that the mountains are still looking good there. We kind of scale this along a little bit more on this axis. One issue with this is not really we're impacted as much by it because the lighting is mainly coming from this side, but there's still some lighting coming from our HDRI. It's blocking it because it's effectively this huge plane that's just sitting in our scene blocking the lighting. So what you're going to do is go over to Object, Properties, go down to Visibility, and then for Ray Visibility, you don't want the shadow checked on. So I'm just going to uncheck the shadow. So that allows this to just kind of be in the background. If you don't like how that looks, you can also adjust the emission a little bit. I'm going to brighten this up just a little bit more in my shader properties for our image here, our Santorini sky. And this is basically it. This is basically the scene. It looks fantastic already. But let's actually add in another element here too. So I have this site that I've actually worked with on a number of projects before. We actually did a contest a couple years ago. It's called Scan the World, My Mini Factory. And they've scanned a bunch of real world objects like pots and pans and sculptures and different things. And this is a really fantastic resource, and it's all royalty free. You can see the licensing here for you, but you can download these as OBJs and then bring them into your scene. So you can bring these into your scene. So if I go back over to Blender, File, Import, and then I go to OBJ, you can see it's huge. So we're gonna wanna scale this down a bit here. And I also don't want this to be in my building collection. I'm just gonna add this to our main collection and our Santorini sky in there too. And let's actually add these two into our lighting scene. So this is gonna be where the lighting is gonna go. And I'm gonna make this labeled yellow just for lighting. And so this pot is huge still, and also it doesn't have a texture. You see this texture is broken. So we're gonna add in one of those clay textures to this as well. For this one, I'm gonna use more of like kind of the potter looking ones. So let's add in maybe this, let's see here. We can do one that's a little bit more sculpted, this clay 3 here. Let's add that in. Take a second to load, and it's now applied into our texture, which looks great. I'm just gonna scale this down, and I'm gonna hit Object, Set Origin to Center of Mass, because I'm noticing that is not centered, and I can scale this up now. I actually kind of do like how that brown texture looks for it. Let's maybe put this over here into the sun. So we can have this kind of sitting outside our door, get this little kind of piece of ancient pottery here sitting outside there as well. If I want to adjust the color, I can always do that. Maybe just adjust it just a little bit. So it's, you know, maybe a little bit brighter or whatnot. So it's looking pretty good. So we've got this scene already all mapped out here as well. I can kind of rename this just so it's a little bit easier for me to follow. And so if you want to stop here, you can stop here. You can also adjust a lot of these textures. Like I said, this frame stepping allows you to animate things. You can also adjust a number of other things in here as well too, the sheen of it. So if I don't want this to be, you know, quite as shiny here, I can kind of pull this back a bit. If you can bring this up a bit, you see it's a little bit more kind of this wet look to it, as if it was kind of freshly laid on, which I think is kind of nice too for certain details, but I don't really want it as much for this. I kind of want it to be more dried on texture. You can also adjust the roughness of it too, just to show you how much that's laid up there too. So that looks great. So you see this really matches pretty well our references, and that was a very quick little model to kind of get that looking that way. All right, so now what I'm gonna do is add in a new collection, and we're gonna call this vegetation. And we're gonna be using the vegetation add-on from B-Production here as well. And so if I go over to B-Production, this loads up really well. I don't really need the texturing as much here. I mainly wanna see my scene a lot more. And we're gonna add in some kind of nice frame to this with our different vegetation. This is broken up into a number of different categories. I really like a lot of the garden plants that are in here. And you can bring these in a super simple way by just literally clicking append, and this appends the asset to your scene. You can also give it some animation too, which is really nice. If you want to animate the leaves, you can do that. It's got some presets for medium, strong wind, and light breeze. But you can bring these around and just kind of frame them up in your scene. And I'm trying to go match a little bit the effect that I saw here, where you got these kind of plants climbing up the side, really vibrant colors to them. You got some of these kind of olive trees here in the background too. So let's actually add in some olive trees as well. And there's some that are in the B-Production vegetation asset library as well. And these are really just fantastic just to give a little bit of extra detail to your scene in a super simple way. You see, also gives some nice shadowing effect too to the scene. You can bring these in here. I'm just going to scale this one up as well. Gonna move this on over a bit more. And I just really like the shadows that it's casting on this scene. It just looks very realistic, very beautiful. And you can also just hit Alt and D to make a link to duplicates. You're not duplicating these over from scratch every single time. And you just kind of use these to maybe fill out different parts of your scene. And then I also want maybe a couple of climbers. So we can go over to the climbers here. And let's maybe add in this one right here. You can see it's got some nice kind of vines to it. And if I kind of bring this up here, you see it kind of nicely is climbing along this back wall now. Maybe move this down a bit so you can actually see this a bit better. But you can see this kind of climbing up the wall here as if this is kind of grown up into the building. This looks really nice. If I zoom in here a bit more, you can see that effect. Looks really great. Let's add in these flowers up top, kind of growing off it. Similar to those flowers that we saw in our reference image. You can maybe add in another one of these climbers on the other side of the building. And then kind of scale this up a little bit too. I'm going to shift this at 270. And then just add that in there. So this is kind of growing through that window. Again, just adding a little extra photorealism here so that that window has this kind of extra element on it. Growing up the side. Scale these down a little bit here so you can kind of see this a bit more. It's looking pretty good. So it looks pretty good. And then maybe we can add in a couple of these shrubs to our scene as well. So I don't want stumps, I want these shrubs here. So there's these nice little bushes that you can kind of add in to the scene for maybe the bottom part here. This is kind of like growing up on this side. These kind of little shrubs here just kind of taking over the scene a little bit on that side. Maybe kind of building out of this a bit. And this pot is maybe sitting in the midst of all this here. Maybe we add some flowers in on that pot there as well too. See if we can add something like that in. Looks pretty good. And you just kind of scale and move these around here too, and you just kind of get them looking nice in the scene. Super simple, super easy. I want to just kind of sort by all these here. You can look through and kind of just see the whole variety of plants that are available in here. There's quite a few different ones. You got these nice kind of hanging ones as well. If you wanted to add some of these ones in over top the scene, maybe we add one of these in kind of creeping across the archway here on this side maybe. Looks quite nice. Kind of more built into it. We still do want to see a lot of that really nice texture that we kind of built into our scene. But not kind of hide it too much. But I still do really like some of these hanging plants as well. So I'm going to kind of bring a couple into my scene just to kind of fill out some of these details as well. So that's looking pretty good. So you've got this nice scene built out here, and this is super simple to put together. And, just the modeling of it was already very easy to do. The clay texture from the production enhanced the scene even more. And then adding in these extra details of vegetation, I encourage you to play around with this and just have fun with this scene and make it your own. So hoping to make a lot more tutorials very soon. Like I said, have been very busy the past couple months, but actually finally having a bit of free time here to dial in and make some of these things. I'm also going to be moving to a new studio space soon that will be really nice to film a lot of these productions. So thanks so much for tuning in, and I will catch you on the next one.